Okay.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome. It's a great pleasure to welcome both our alumni and as well the members of the public who are here today to join us for this very special evening. And it's especially a great pleasure for me to host this event along with the Maxwell Schools Advisory Board and to be able to bring one of the Campbell Debate Series here to DC, both for our alumni and for the broader public. I'm delighted that so many people could come here. It reflects not only the importance of the topic and the great debaters we have tonight, but also the unparalleled network of Maxwell alumni that count over 3,500 alumni in the DC area alone. And as I said this evening, I'm honored to have as my co-host the Maxwell Advisory Board. And we have a number of present and past advisory board members here tonight. As you participate and come to the reception afterwards, you'll notice that our advisory board members are wearing little badges with green stars on them, and I hope you'll come up and introduce yourself and share your thoughts. They're an important part of helping us chart the future of the school, and I'm sure they'd love to hear your thoughts as well. We also are honored that Sue Penny is here. She's an emeritus trustee of Syracuse University and has been a great help to me during my time as dean. And along with us tonight, we also have a number of the leaders of the DC Alumni Association, which is really a remarkable group. It's a tremendously energetic and wonderful part of our broader network. And I want to recognize the excellent job that they've been doing for keeping this DC network connected. They've helped put this event together, and they play such an important role in helping us stay connected with our alumni here, including we have with us tonight the President, Charles Cutchell, the Social Media Chair, Sheila Muthemba, Alex Haderly, who's the Social Events Chair, and Joni Weber, the Community Service Chair. Now, as you've already learned, by hosting this Campbell Debates here tonight, we're trying to do something that we believe very strongly at the Maxwell School needs to happen more frequently all across America, to see more engaged debate that's substantive, lively, but also civil. The Campbell Debates are a reflection of one of the most important parts of the Maxwell School's mission, the study and promotion of citizenship, a commitment that's reflected not only in the name of our school, but also in the Athenian oath that our students take when they graduate. And of course, campaign finance is an issue of perennial interest and importance to our political system. And now is a good time to look back on the experiences from 2012 and to consider what we should do going forward. Employing a style adapted from the Oxford Union debates, each Campbell debate asks the audience to consider a question of national, regional, or local significance. With recent debates taking place on the intersection of religion and politics, gun control, hydrofracking, and increasing taxes on the wealthy, Grant Rear, who's the director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute, has brought the Campbell Debates to audiences in Syracuse, and I'm very pleased he's here tonight to host tonight's program. The Campbell Debates tagline is, and I quote, "disagreement in the public interest." And I think you'll go away from this evening with a more thoughtful, nuanced, and thorough understanding of the complex issues involved in campaign finance reform. So it's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce Grant, who's done an extraordinary job as the director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute and the person who's really been the motivating force behind this programming. In addition to being a professor of political science at Maxwell, Grant is also host and program director for the Campbell Conversations, a weekly interview-based public affairs show airing on the WRVO stations across central New York. And although it's not in my promo here for WRVO, you can get the app and you can listen to it anywhere. A frequent political and public affairs commentator for radio, television, and print, he's written scores of newspaper editorials and has authored, co-authored, or co-edited numerous books. His most recent is The Trusted Leader, Building the Relationships That Make Government Work. So please, thank you. Let me thank you first for coming, and then join me in welcoming Grant Rear in the Campbell Debates.
Thank you, Jim, for that introduction. And I also want to thank you and the Dean's Office for your support of this event and also for our work at Campbell more generally. We're particularly excited to be able to host one of our debates here in Washington, and we hope that we can come back. The question before you tonight is whether or not our campaign finance system is broken. And as Jim said, this is an issue of perennial concern, and having a bit of distance from the 2012 election experience with the next cycle already upon us, I think is a good time to reconsider it. We've got a fantastic set of folks to debate this issue. The Fantastic Four is what I'll call them. And I want to point out that they have donated their time here tonight as well as their preparation time in order to do this, and both Campbell and Maxwell are very grateful to them for that. I won't introduce them to you because you have their short bios in the brochure that you got on the way in. I'll just simply identify them, and then you will meet them in just a minute. In favor of the proposition, we have, in the order in which they will speak, Marc Elias and Bob Edgar. Against the proposition, we have Benjamin Barr and David Mason. I also want to thank Kelly Coleman, Bethany Wallowender, and Stephanie Lee of the Campbell Institute, who have worked very hard to put this event together. And I want to also thank the folks from the Dean's office who are helping out this evening, in particular Ann Wicks and Norma Shannon. Now, very briefly, let me go over the ground rules and the expectations, particularly for what you can do to make this debate a success, because your participation is essential in this. The more specific ground rules were contained in the handouts that you received when you entered. First, if you haven't already done so, please silence your smartphones. And as I said, we have 4 panelists who are going to debate the proposition. The speakers will alternate between each side, and they'll each have initially about 7 minutes to speak. And then they'll have an opportunity as teams to further rebut and question what the other has said. After that, we open it up to you. You'll be able to pose questions or make points directed to one or the other teams or both. Please, if you have something that you'd like to say, raise your hands. We have 2 microphones that will be passed you, and we ask for 2 things. First, that you wait to get a microphone, as we want to have your comments be part of the archive program. And second, that you're brief and to the point, because I'm sure that there's going to be many of you who will want to speak, and of course we have limited time. And then each team will have a very brief chance to make a closing argument, and after that, you are going to render your decision. I'll say more about this at the end of the debate. And the reception that follows outside, you'll have a chance to meet the debaters and to continue the conversation. So I think that about covers it. Now please welcome the 4 debaters. And Marc Elias, the floor is yours.
Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here, and I always appreciate the opportunity to talk about important issues such as the one that presents itself tonight, which is whether or not the current system of campaign finance is broken. So at the outset, let me just say a few things. Number one, my views that I'm going to express are not that of any of my clients. They're my views alone. The second is that as I reflected on this, I did 2 things. First is I talked to my daughter, who is 11 years old, and I said that I was going to be doing this debate, and she said, well, how could you possibly lose that? I mean, who's going to say it's not broken? And I said, there are other people who are going to say it's not broken. She said, well, if you lose, don't come home. Not that I'm trying to influence any of your votes, but I have a family. The second is that my daughter reminded me that when she was 6 and asked me to play a board game with her, the first thing I did, being a lawyer, was I said, fine, I'll play Chutes and Ladders, but I want to read the instructions, because I want to figure out how I can win. So the resolution is not whether the campaign finance system ought to be more regulated or ought to be less regulated. You're going to hear a lot from others tonight saying that the problem with the campaign finance system is it's too burdensome, it's not burdensome enough. My proposition is simply this: it is broken as it sits today. Not whether the fix for the brokenness is a libertarian fix, or is a public financing fix, or is a higher limits or lower limits, or more super PACs or fewer super PACs, but rather that the system as it exists today in 2013 is unquestionably broken. And I think you will agree at the end of the night. So to understand why it is broken, let's go back in time to the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971 as amended in 1974, which is this book. It's orange, and this is the book. Congress passed this law. In fact, we have a member of Congress who passed this law. And it was passed not as a series of isolated provisions, but as a tapestry, as a fabric that held together. And immediately upon passage, the threads started getting pulled out. So in the seminal case, Buckley v. Vallejo, the Federal Election Campaign Act, which initially had not just the limits you're aware of, but had, for example, expenditure limits by campaigns themselves. Well, the Supreme Court looked at that and said, no, you can't do that. So now the book's got a few fewer pages. And there were limits on what the candidates could spend themselves, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't limit that, so we'll just take those pages out. But the rest of the book is still here. And over the course of the last 40 years, what we have had is that fabric, that tapestry, have more and more threads pulled out. So for example, in the 80s, we learned that notwithstanding the fact that there is a ban on corporate expenditures, before Citizens United, the Supreme Court said in a case involving a nonprofit Right to Life group, well, that ban doesn't apply to certain kinds of corporations. If they have memberships, if they just raise individual money, you don't need those pages either. So now you're looking at the book and thinking, well, okay, well, still kind of a book. And then along the way, the Supreme Court said, well, we know that there's a ban on parties, political parties making independent expenditures. You can't have that either. So those pages came out of the book. Right? One by one, more pages came out of the book, and the tapestry grew thinner and thinner. In the Roberts Court, before Citizens United, another nonprofit group, another Right to Life group came and said, well, we want to run ads within a certain time period before elections, and they're going to mention candidates, and there's a ban on that, and the Supreme Court said, well, we can take those out too. And then, of course, in Citizens United, they took the biggest chunk out. Right? They took the most pages out in striking down the ban on corporate independent expenditures. The resulting system simply makes no sense. If you are, as some people will argue tonight, an avid libertarian, and you believe there should be no limits on anything, then you just take the book and you throw it away. Right? I can understand that. I might not agree with it, but I understand it. What I do not understand is the current system in which the political parties can only raise limited money and members can't solicit corporate money for them. A super PAC running independent expenditures, though, can raise unlimited money from unlimited sources. Members can solicit $5,000 for them. Not $10,000, but $5,000. And they can attend, speaker to be a featured guest at their events, even if those events raise more than $5,000. There is not a member of Congress, not Mitch McConnell on the right, not any Democrat on the left, who would have taken this system, this book as it currently stands, and said, this is a system that we want. The system is fundamentally broken because what has happened over the last 40 years is that various pieces of this system have been taken out and it simply does not work. The entire law of super PACs is made up. I know, I was involved in making it up. I brought some of the cases, I brought some of the actions for the FEC to create super PACs. There is nothing in this book called super PACs. Go Google the Federal Election Campaign Act for super. There's nothing super in this book. It's entirely a made-up area, and it doesn't hang together. The statute no longer makes any sense. Bert Newborn, who was a professor at NYU at the time, wrote in 1997 that Buckley, the original case that upheld most of the book but took certain pages out, is a rotten tree. It's a rotten tree, he said. He said, give it a good hard push, and like a rotten tree, Buckley will keel over. The only question is in which direction. There are people on the left pushing on the tree and people on the right pushing on the tree. But the one thing we can all agree on is that it's a rotten tree. Or, as the resolution says, the current system of campaign finance is broken. You might disagree in this audience, as you will hear others tonight on the panel will disagree, as to whether it is broken because it needs to be pushed from the right or pushed from the left. But when you take your ballot, and by the way, I noticed it's a secret ballot. Okay. When you have your secret ballot and you're voting, ask yourself, is anyone here telling you that the system is not broken, that that tree should stand exactly where it is in the ground? Thank you very much. I urge you to support the proposition.
Thank you.
Yep.
Ben's next.
All right. Well, I wanted to go.
Ben
next.
Barr. You'll get there.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ben Barr, and I have the distinct pleasure of being able to work with grassroots groups nationwide that get stuck in the complicated maze that Marc just described of campaign finance reform. And I'm in the odd position tonight to tell you about why the system that we are describing, in fact, is not broken, but is in a very good place. And I think what we need to do is set a foundational term, and that is to say, we're not arguing about a perfected utopian law. Those don't exist. What we're asking is whether the system in question, federal election law and election law in general, meets its stated goals and is still sensitive to constitutional liberties. I think based on that standard, you'll find that the resounding answer is yes, it is working. Now, Marc seems to have some problems with tripartite government. What we have in the United States is a system of judicial review that allows the courts to step in and to rip pages out of books so that individuals like Ms. McIntyre are able to go out and speak anonymously, so that right-to-life groups that can't afford to waive themselves through complicated federal regulatory regimes are able to speak, and the like. We're able to lift bans, and we're able to realize constitutional liberties. What I want to do is just step back for a moment and move into that. If any of you were paying attention during the 2012 election cycle, what struck me every night on MSNBC and CNN as we moved through the primaries and especially closer to the general election was these apocalyptic calls about the Koch brothers dominating the electoral process and how broken our system is, about how Karl Rove was going to seize control with dark money, these shadowy organizations. Billionaire bandits were going to rip through the United States and end our fine democratic tradition. Of course, it's 2013 today. We do not have President Romney. The Republicans do not have a lead in the Senate. And we can look back to past electoral cycles and see this. We know that money's important. It allows people to get their voices out. But it hasn't caused these catastrophic injuries that are so often predicted, and there's a great deal of emotion behind them, but to which there's little evidence to suggest it's actually occurring. Americans spend more money on potato chips, on video games. Procter & Gamble spends more money on getting you to buy soap than we do in the electoral process. I want to move on and just, this pairs with what Mr. Elias spoke about making a somewhat hodgepodge system. I see campaign finance law right now on a very similar trajectory to other regulatory systems and other legal systems that have come in contact with the Constitution and with the First Amendment. So it's very normal, for example, in the area of defamation law. The Legal Academy used to think that we had a very broad authority to regulate defamatory comments. And it took challenges through the courts for the Supreme Court to develop a steady doctrine, a coherent doctrine, to properly limit the scope of defamation law. So one of the prime examples of this is New York Times versus Sullivan. There, the Supreme Court had invalidated vague and overbroad provisions that stopped newspapers from being able to describe civil rights abuses against minorities in the South. It was very important. The court reasoned that we need to provide clear standards. We need to make sure there's uniformity here. We see this in myriad other areas of law as well, from Falwell versus Hustler, narrowing tort claims when they come in contact with the First Amendment, and the like, pornography, anti-obscenity provisions. So it is a very normal thing for regulatory systems over time to find themselves pared down to their proper constitutional underpinnings. So where we're at today, there's no doubt that we're at a stage where, as Mr. Elias notes, parties suffer a disadvantage against outside groups. But we also know that for years, outside groups faced absolute bans on their ability to speak. In the Citizens United oral argument, The Deputy Solicitor General went so far as to suggest that the federal government had the ability to ban books under these provisions. These are rightful actions under our system of judicial review. It doesn't mean that the system is irreparably injured or that it's damaged beyond repair. It means that campaign finance law is moving in the correct direction. It's being properly shrunken so that it respects the constitutional liberties of individuals to be able to go out and speak while still achieving its goals. Maybe that means policy preference-wise for some of us that we'd like to see more rigorous enforcement of the like. But at the end of the day, we're left with judicial review. I spoke to in the beginning, the fact that I represent grassroots groups. I have an organization currently in court with the FEC asking it for guidance over some very basic concepts in the law, which it's struggling to do. So I understand this dissatisfaction, I understand this frustration. But what I'm asking you as a chamber to do is to look at the long-term perspectives. We don't come to an immediate perfect answer. What we do is we narrow this steadily, slowly, and we get it to the correct place. We're moving in that direction. We're seeing increased liberalization of campaign finance rules throughout the United States. I think before the FEC as well. There are more challenges against it, and it will reach the same place as other systems have. And in that sense, it's not broken. This argument here is not against the ideal. It is not against perfection, but it is about we have a workable system. It may not be our first preference, but it serves its goals and it protects the First Amendment rights of speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now,
Bob Edgar.
you saw me so eager to get up here after Marc's presentation. I was going to rip papers up, but I'll hold off on doing that. I'm Bob Edgar, and I'm the Forrest Gump of religion and politics. I was a preacher at age 19. I was a congressman at age 31. I was president of a graduate school for 10 years after I left Congress. I spent 7.5 years as general secretary of the National Council of Churches. So I come not as a lawyer and not getting so deep into the legal aspects of this, but I want to begin by saying the current system of campaign finance is broken, Ben. It's smashed, it's crushed, it's hijacked, it's poisoned, taken hostage by money and partisan politics. Now, I'm the only one on the panel that served 6 terms, 12 years in Congress. I had to file all those forms, and back then, money was important. But there was full disclosure of money. There were political action committees. There weren't these crazy things called super PACs. Back then, we were living under laws that had been put in place way, way back, including the Tillman Act in 1907, when a Republican president was scared to death that the robber barons, the oil companies, and the mineral interest and the railroad interest were going to buy up democracy. And in 1907, he signed the Tillman Act to say that corporations shouldn't meddle in our politics. Well, I have to say, democracy's in real trouble. Not only is the campaign finance system broken, but I think this audience knows that Washington is broken. We were founded on the principle of we the people, and that we the people would have rights. My friend Bill Moyers says this is the most dangerous moment in American history for democracy. We're either going to be a nation that's of and by and for the people, or of and by and for large corporations and the wealthy. Citizens United, a 5-4 decision by the Supreme Court. 5-4. If Sandra Day O'Connor had still been on the court, it would have been 5-4 the other way. 5-4 said corporations and labor unions could use corporate treasury in politics. Now, Common Cause, the organization that I'm very active with as president, we were nervous about corporations meddling in politics. It really didn't happen like we thought it would happen. Corporations have meddled a bit in politics. There was an interesting case in Minnesota where after Citizens United, the Target Corporation thought a good idea was to give a large contribution to a candidate who was bad on gay, lesbian, and transgendered issues. So they gave him a large contribution. A couple of my staff and some coalition partners went and put a television camera out and started asking Target, and suddenly the Target Corporation realized that their brand identity was threatened if they in fact meddled in politics. And those companies that have sensitive brand identity that we saw flee from the American Legislative Exchange Council last year when it got called out on the Stand Your Ground law and the ALEC provision, people like Johnson & Johnson and Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola, they fled pretty quickly because they didn't want to meddle in politics. But Ben, I got to say, money is soiling and breaking and crushing our system. And you tried to add to the myth that's out there that money wasn't involved in this last campaign. You're right. The dark money and the bad money that some of us were concerned about didn't win every election, but they drove the election money up, and all parties, whether they were good or bad, had to raise how much money they put in the system. Now, when I served in Congress, I had to raise money for my reelection. But in those days, the special interest groups came first with their talking points, and then, if they liked you, they came with their checkbooks, gave legal contributions. What happens now is the Democrats and Republicans both have learned that they'll have galas the day before the opening session or the night of the opening session. And they'll invite all the lobbyists to come to meet all of the freshman Republicans and Democrats, and they'll bring their bundled checks. They don't really care so much about the talking points. And many of the elected officials today who want to stay in Congress forever are more interested in the money. Let's be clear. More than $6 billion was spent in the 2012 election, and it pales in comparison to the billions of dollars that special interests got from that contribution, that access to our elected officials. Yes, money has crushed the system, and Citizens United has added and fueled to that process of breaking the system that we have. It is simply not true that Citizens United didn't make much of a difference in 2012. It's also important to recognize that our campaign finance system is now seeing more secret money and anonymous money. And you guys will be interested to know that 8 of the 9 justices came together and said the House of Representatives should pass full disclosure legislation. It went over to the Senate for their consideration. They couldn't even get the bill on the floor. It got 59 votes in the United States Senate so that anonymous donations couldn't be made, so that foreign corporations couldn't meddle in our politics after Citizens United. 8 of the 9 justices said that was a good idea. It failed because it didn't pass the filibuster. Now, I just have to urge you to really think. If you lived in Virginia, particularly a battleground state, you couldn't turn on your television last election. Obama raised $1.1 billion. Romney raised $1 billion. The super PACs were raising money. But here's an interesting fact. 100 people, just about the number of people in this room, had more than half of the money that was involved in the political campaign. You heard about the young man, the businessman from Las Vegas, who was willing to spend $100 million to get Romney elected if he had to, or supporting any of the candidates who could beat Obama. Money is soiling our system. Dr. Martin Luther King said, "You and I will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of bad people, but for the appalling silence of good people. You good people, support our effort. The campaign financing system is broken."
Thank you. David Mason.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming out, talk about this important topic. I'm fascinated by Congressman Edgar's biography, and I just wanted to ask, preacher, then politician, how did you explain this to your family?
It's hard to explain it to reporters.
So the campaign finance system is broken. What do we mean by that? I actually agree with part of what Mr. Elias said, maybe a significant part of what Mr. Elias said, that when we say the campaign finance system is broken, we probably don't mean, we can't properly mean, that the system isn't to my preferences, or to Congressman Edgar's preferences, or to some other one person's preferences, because nobody gets to pick their entire suite of administrative or legal provisions that they're going to want. So what is it that we mean when the system is broken? Mr. Elias seems to suggest it's because it's incoherent, because the law has been developed first by statute and then by administrative rule. I think Mr. Barr properly made the point that this is the way administrative law works. But I want to address it maybe in sort of 5 parts. And the first is to say, what do we mean broken? Because I'm not sure that's been defined well. The second is to look at alternatives, because a lot of times when we say it's broken, it's in terms of alternatives. And I want to suggest that it's a little bit like what Winston Churchill said about democracy. I'm not sure this was, whether it's apocryphal or not, that it's the worst possible system of government, except for all of the others. And there are a lot of compromises in the campaign finance system. And there are certainly things that I would change if I got to be king for a day. But I think the system is actually working decently well, and it's not fundamentally broken. The third point is that politics is not a spectator sport. And Americans should be able to get involved in political campaigns in ways beyond simply casting a vote. And a lot of the reforms that are supported as alternatives to the current system would prohibit that, would stop that. Fourth, that a lot of the critiques of politics in Washington and how bad things are and how partisan things are and what doesn't happen in Washington and what should happen in Washington are relying on the campaign finance system to fix a problem that the campaign finance system can't fix. It's simply not a match. In other words, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. There are certain things that the campaign finance rules can do, and there are lots of things that campaign finance rules can't do. They can't deal with partisanship. It has other sources. But I think lastly, and I'll go back to some of these other points, I want to introduce some names into the debate, because Mr. Barr mentioned Karl Rove, and he's famous or infamous, as you prefer, and the Koch brothers, and there are all kinds, and Target Corporation, and we hear all of these names of bad actors in the system. And I want to discuss some other names who probably ought to be more prominent than they are. And I'll start with Christopher Tagani. Has anyone here heard of Christopher Tagani? Mr. Elias has something in the back of his mind that reminds him, and I'll tell him why in just a moment. Jerry Pierce Santos. Is he here? I didn't think so. Okay. Gladwin Gill. Joseph Vass. Joseph Begica. May know who he is. Mr. Elias will smile now. Pierce O'Donnell. Paul Magliacetti. That list is a list of people who in the last 2 or 3 years, have gone to jail for violations of the Federal Election Campaign Act. And in fact, in the last half dozen years or so, since the first cases were brought under the McCain-Feingold Act, there have been at least 42 criminal prosecutions that have come to indictment, plea, or verdict. 14 people have gone to jail. 11 have been convicted or pled guilty and been sentenced to probation or other fines, and 16 are pending sentence. 2, one Jeffrey Feiger and John Edwards, were acquitted by juries. Not 39 to 2, not a bad record for prosecutors. Now, what's my point here? Some bad people went to jail. I certainly don't defend anything that any of those people did, but my point is that the campaign finance system, the core purpose of the system, is to prevent corruption. And in fact, that's working well. There are corrupt people who did bad things in elections, and they were caught, found out, prosecuted, and they're going to jail. Now, if you want to fix the way Congress operates, there are lots of things that you can do. And the campaign finance system certainly will have some influence on it, but it's not going to be the main determinant. The main determinant of who wins elections is the partisan composition of the district. It has to do with redistricting, not campaign finance. It has to do with state election law. And so if you're looking to stop bad activity in connection with elections, we've actually gotten the law calibrated pretty well. In fact, perhaps too well. Mr. Begika's case was illustrative. He admitted to violating the federal campaign finance law to something less than $200,000. The penalty for that was 5 years in jail. He admitted to a $2 million tax fraud, and the penalty was 3 years in jail. So in fact, we've gotten the penalties calibrated, and I suppose there's an argument. There's more harm to the public in stealing an election than in stealing tax money. But we've got the penalties calibrated, so there's some fairly serious penalties out there. They're working. And I know a lot of this critique isn't going to be about the amount of money in politics. Mr. Edgar did talk about that. And I want to make one point in defense of that. 25 years or so ago, I had a landline phone in my house and a $20 phone bill. Today, I have this great smartphone and a family data plan that I pay $200 a month for. I'm happy. It's 10 times as much, and I think that's a good thing, and that's a lot of what's gone on with campaign finance over the same period of time. Thank you.
Thank you. So the affirmative now will have 10 minutes for rebuttals, questions. Time is yours.
Marc, you did an excellent job.
Well, thank you. So do I have your vote?
You have my vote. As you recall in my comments, I raised the issue of full disclosure, and Citizens United impacted on that. When it comes to outside spending, just 100 donors contributed $470 million to super PACs in the last election cycle. That almost half of all the money that super PACs spent in the last election came from these 100 donors. And according to figures from the Center for Responsive Politics, secret groups that don't even need to disclose their donors spent an additional $300 million. They flooded the airways with ads and commercials, which I mentioned. So talk about the issue of disclosure so that our friends here can fully understand the impact that not having clear disclosure laws in place impact.
So I think you made a very important point, and I think it's one of the things that as you all consider whether or not the current system is broken, I want to bring you back in time to the late 90s and the debates over McCain-Feingold. McCain-Feingold was a sweeping bill. It banned soft money, it instituted restrictions on parties, it did a whole bunch of things. And if you remember the counter-argument by the then, I believe then, chair of the Rules Committee, the Republican, or at least a Republican ranking member on the Rules Committee, Mitch McConnell, was the talking point of the day on the right. It was, we do not need all this, what we need is disclosure. And we don't just need any kind of disclosure. We need instant disclosure. We need quick disclosure. We need internet-based disclosure, World Wide Web disclosure, searchable, sortable, all kinds of things. We just need disclosure. And we need a lot of it, we need it quickly. And if we just have that, we don't need the rest of the limits and the laws. And after Citizens United, the Supreme Court in Citizens United by a decision 8-1, Justice Scalia favored disclosure, right? This was not just liberals. Following Citizens United, an 8-1 decision in favor of disclosure, you might have thought that the right, that many Republicans would have said, oh, this is great. We've gotten what we've always wanted. We have more money, more ability to spend money in unlimited ways. And it is finally our moment to put in place all of that instant, searchable, sortable, World Wide Web disclosure. And the Disclose Act came up, and it got 59 Democratic votes, or 59 votes of senators who caucused with the Democrats, and not a single Republican vote in the US Senate. And the fact is that we have a system, to quote a colleague of mine at Perkins Coie, Carl Sandstrom, where we have public anonymity and private disclosure. So in private, there is nothing that prohibits the gentleman who you used as your hypothetical from sitting down with a member and saying, you know, I gave all of this money to a group last year that ran these ads that help you. But there's no public disclosure. So I think, you know, it is one of these things where 8 justices of the Supreme Court can agree. By the way, a later case, Doe v. Reed, came before the Supreme Court, which involved the disclosure of petition signers, people who support petitions. Justice Scalia not only supported disclosure, he went into a long opinion about how we don't even necessarily need secret ballots. People should stand up in the town square and be accountable for their political activity. So this doesn't have to be a partisan issue. It can be a bipartisan issue. It can be an issue across the ideological spectrum. But it's one of the things that's broken, because in fact we don't have that. And I will be interested during their time to hear from our colleagues about how they think the system's not broken there. But I want to ask you, Congressman, a question. You were in Congress for much of the Federal Election Campaign Act that I referenced and ripped up. Is this at all what Congress had in mind?
Absolutely not. You guys need to remember how I got to Congress. 1 year before I got elected to Congress, I had never been to a political meeting. I was a chaplain at Drexel University in the city of Philadelphia. But on October 20th, 1973, Richard Nixon fired Archibald Cox for asking for the Watergate tapes. I was startled that the person being investigated could, in fact, fire the prosecutor. So I looked the word Democratic up in the telephone book, and a year later, got elected in the most Republican district in the nation to have a Democratic congressman. And I was appalled at the millions of dollars that were involved in Watergate, paying off people to keep their silence and paying off the burglars. But also, I have to say, a whole group of reformers came to Washington. We were sort of the liberal Tea Party. There were 75 Democrats and there were 17 Republicans who arrived in Washington. We unseated 5 Democratic chairs who were chairs by seniority only, people like Wilbur Mills, who had fallen into the tidal basin, and Eddie Hebert.
Fallen, huh?
Fallen. But as Watergate babies, as reformers, we were very clear that we wanted bipartisan election rules and regulations with full disclosure. And the rules back then were fairly complicated. We never anticipated that the rules would be chopped up, changed, altered. And you know, when the Citizens United decision came down, there was a conversation about corporations are people because the corporations use this legal fiction. I went home, and you were talking about your family, but my wife said, who's a retired operating room nurse, she said, I'll believe corporations are people the day after they have a colonoscopy. And the Supreme Court also said that money is speech. Well, yeah, they're right. Money is speech protected under the First Amendment, but money can also stifle speech. And I raised an issue, which is, why shouldn't it be okay for legislators, whether they're city council members or whether they're state legislators or whether they're federal congresspeople, why shouldn't they be able to regulate money in politics? After we put the former governor of Connecticut, one of the former governors, in jail for getting his fingers caught in the cookie jar, we installed a public financing system in Connecticut that's working. And it's a voluntary system, and more than 74% of the candidates, both Democratic and Republican, used it, took no money from special interest. More than 80% of them got elected in 08, 010, and again in 012. Why shouldn't that be permitted? And why should there be any restrictions by this very narrowly drawn Supreme Court, who is breaking down on these issues, often on political grounds, 5-4? So the answer to your question is specifically, no, we thought the system could work. We wanted to be as nonpartisan as possible. We wanted it to be as clear as possible. And I think it may be time to actually redo the Federal Election Commission. What reforms would you make? We only have a couple minutes.
Well, why don't I use the couple of minutes to ask Commissioner Mason.
That's a good idea.
You were at the commission at a time when many of these rules were being written. Do you think that that the disclosure regime that the commission has right now meets the has the practical effect of informing the public who is supporting independent spending.
Yes, I do.
Thank you very much.
Wow, I thought that was going to be an opportunity for you.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Mark,
If there is an organization, a 501c organization, where one individual funds the entire organization, and then that organization then runs independent expenditures, you think that the current system, which some have argued would not require the disclosure of that individual as the funder, you think provides adequate disclosure?
I'm not concerned, and I will say the rules that the commission wrote when I was a member allow something like that, depending on how the donation is structured, just as many other legal arrangements do. But more fundamentally, this is an issue about what level of disclosure you think should apply, and I don't think that critique by itself represents a system being broken. In other words, you may think there should be more disclosure or less disclosure. I don't think the system is so out of whack that we could say it's broken. We have lots of disclosure, and I don't have find anybody who has any trouble finding out that it was the Kochs or Karl Rove or some other bad actor who was behind just about every particular ad on TV.
I have to say, I'm surprised at both of you talking about how great the system is. I ran for office, and I would find it very troubling to run under the current broken system. But I want to say this. The moral test of government, as Hubert Humphrey once said, is what we do for those in the dawn of life, our children, those in the twilight of life, the elderly, and all of those in the shadows of life. I think one of the problems we have today is that money is corroding the system. Money is buying congressmen, stuffing them on committees and subcommittees. And I really believe that corporations and particularly individual billionaire money is soiling the system.
And that is your time. Thank you. Negative will have 10 minutes for their rebuttal.
When I look back at the 2012 election cycle, particularly for Republicans, I find it difficult to describe the system as broken when we allowed the primary season to have more choices, more candidates, more discussion, and more speech. That is the central tenet of self-government in the American tradition. Voters were allowed to learn about Newt Gingrich's plans to jet off to the moon. They could learn about Ron Paul's plans on foreign policy and his unique views on libertarian philosophy. There was more debate, there was more discussion, there were prolonged primary seasons, more information exchange. This is a result of liberalization of campaign finance rules. This is a result of the increased free flow of money, thus then ideas and speech in the political process. This is a net good under the First Amendment, not an evil. We may not like who's speaking. We may not prefer that they're speaking. We may call them dark money or shadowy or the like. But at the end of the day, it's provided a service, a good service to the American people. I want to go back to Mr. Edgar's comments about running in the Nixon era. One of the first judicial treatments of this grand disclosure and transparency system we're talking about was the committee in support of impeachment of President Nixon in 1972 before the Second Circuit. And they were so daring to put an ad in the New York Times suggesting that President Nixon was unfit for office and suggesting that his stance on the Vietnam War was incorrect. Well, the DOJ came down and promptly obtained an injunction. They stopped speech. Disclosure stopped speech because they didn't register and comply with the complicated maze of federal election provisions. Now, they won in the Second Circuit. And the Second Circuit said, it's abhorrent to think if the federal government has the power to impose regulatory authority over groups talking about the environment, talking about wartime policy, talking about popular issues, and they have to now register with the federal government, report how much money they have, go through all this detailed accounting nonsense. You're not going to have this sort of vibrant participation by grassroots in the political process. So the story that I was trying to outlay during my initial presentation is we're at a good place in campaign finance reform. We've been lifting bans. We've been allowing people to speak. We started in Buckley by saying you can't stop, we can't put a cap on how much people reach out and share their points of views. That's a good under the First Amendment. We had an audacious view in Massachusetts Citizens for Life that a small nonprofit corporate group like Boys and like Big Brother, Big Sister, or the like, that they could share their views, that they might be able to spend money in the political process. That's a good thing. Gradual liberalization of the rules to take the Federal Election Campaign Act and put it in accord with the First Amendment so that Americans can participate in the political process. They can engage in that sort of grassroots back and forth that's important and that we celebrate here. That's what's at stake. And if we view it in that historical lens, we've lifted restrictions, we've enhanced participation, we've allowed this to occur, and we trust the people to make judgments about billionaires speaking, or about groups, or about anonymous arguments, then we realize that promise of self-governance.
So I want to go back to the issue of what we think is too much money, or not enough money, or money from the wrong people, or not enough disclosure, or whatever, and again make the point that the system being broken isn't about any one of us getting our policy preferences, because none of us are going to get our policy preferences. And in particular, the complaint that the courts did this bad thing because they invalidated portions of the statute, they allowed corporate speech, or so on like that, is a deficient basis to say the system is broken, because that is the system, right? Our constitutional government allows for judicial review, and we don't get to decide that. We get to critique the Supreme Court to try to persuade. Presidents are elected, they can appoint new justices. Justices may change their mind, but this is the system. And so the particular critiques of too much money or not enough paperwork or so on like that, I think are misplaced in assessing whether the system is broken or not. But more fundamentally, who gets to decide that? Who says how much money is too much money? Who says this group should be able to speak and that group shouldn't be able to speak? If we're talking about system preference or design, I think that's a very bad idea. And just as Ben suggests, I think having the government in the position of saying, you shut up and you come register before you speak is bad and dangerous. And there have been innumerable situations I could sort of imagine if the Sons of Liberty in the 1770s had been told, well, you can do anything you want, you just have to go to London and register with this office. They wouldn't have been able to do what they did. That's an unusual circumstance, but the liberty that underlies that ought to be here still. Public financing. I know even that preference for or against public financing doesn't address whether the system is broken or not, but it goes to my point about other systems being worse, or at least having their own unique evils. 5 or 6 of the cases, the criminal FICA cases that I mentioned, are in Connecticut. And they're in association, they're federal cases, but they're parallel state cases that are involved where the state public funding law was just too irresistible for crooked politicians, and they recruited people to give conduit contributions to their campaigns so that they could get the state matching funds. The New York Comptroller, John Liu, has just about his entire campaign organization being investigated right now for conduit contributions to get the 6-to-1 matching funds in New York City. One of the party Democratic leaders in New York was just indicted for a similar crime. And so if we take the idea that somehow public financing is a magic bullet to solve corruption, we simply have to look at the reality of those cases and realize that other different types of corruption are indeed spawned by that. I happen to think it's worse. But my point is, it isn't demonstrably better. In other words, that's not a magic solution to the problems that we have out there. In fact, it causes problems that I think are perhaps worse and brings the nexus of the money stronger in and more directly to the politicians than the cases where money is being spent. Politics isn't a spectator sport. I think that groups outside of candidates and campaigns, and even political parties, I think there ought to be more space for political parties. I'm fine with that reform if we want to do that, ought to be able to participate in the political process. And the big danger in more regulation and coming in and trying to fill the gaps is these outside groups, whether they're religious groups or anybody else who wants to speak and gets enmeshed in this regulatory process. And the rules are going to disadvantage the outsiders and disadvantage people who aren't in Washington. And those are precisely the voices that I think should be encouraged. They often take the corporate form. There's nonprofit organizations are normally incorporated for valid legal reasons. And simply to pick on them because of that is I think, wrong-minded. I also, as I discussed before, think that we're relying on the campaign system or the critique of the problems in Washington, and the problems are relying on the campaign finance system or to solve a problem that it can't solve. I think there's a big problem going on, big social challenge that we face as a country with increasing partisanship. And we can blame it on Fox News or Rush Limbaugh or MSNBC or NPR or whoever your least favorite media outlet is. We can blame it on the Tea Party or some corresponding organization out there on the left. But anyone who looks at election returns and at red districts getting redder and blue districts getting bluer understands there's something very fundamental going on out there in the country, which is pushing public opinion and consequently public officials further apart. And I think that presents big challenges for our country. But I think that's reflecting the underlying reality of political opinions in the country. And playing on the margins with campaign finance, sure, it can make a difference. In one race, here or there or another, it can make a difference. But we're trying to use the campaign finance system or to blame the campaign finance system on other problems in the country that need other solutions. So I don't think the campaign finance system is the problem, and in that sense, I don't think it's broken.
Thank you. Okay, so now we have some time for you folks to pose questions, make points. One over here.
Thank you. Rob Zimmer, Syracuse 1982, founder of VoteSane.com, which is the only online platform where one can donate to any federal candidate, regardless of party. My question is the issue today campaign finance law, or rather lazy or inept campaigns? My point being that Obama campaign successfully democratized giving in the last 2 elections. They learned it from McCain, they learned it from Howard Dean. They brought in tremendous numbers of retail donations, small dollar donations from regular citizens. They prevailed twice. The ability to leverage more online small donations exists for any campaign who wants to do the work. Not every campaign does. Should they be doing it? And so it's almost a question of initiative. Maybe the campaign finance law is not perfect, but campaigns can earn their way if they try. And by the way, in the last 3 presidential elections, the less wealthy candidate won.
Are you directing that to one of the other teams?
I will direct that to the group at large, and I want to thank all the participants for wearing the same color suit.
Anybody want to respond?
Well, let me just say a footnote. You're right in the Obama case that about 1/3 of his donors in that first election were small donors. We like that. The next time around, he also raised small donors. But we've been very critical of Obama for not taking the presidential public financing system that worked up until the Obama-McCain election of '08. Obama was the first candidate since Watergate where we put that reform in place because we didn't want the presidents to be spending all of their time raising billions of dollars. Obama spent over 300 days going to fundraisers, raising money for his reelection. I've been critical of Obama recently He came out with this group called Organizing for Action. I think that it's perfectly fine for him to do that, but don't get reported in the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times that you're going to have $500,000 bundlers be at the top and give them access. They've already bought access. I want the president not to disarm. I want him to lead so that the next two candidates who run for president don't each have to raise $1 billion for their reelection. I want him to open up the federal communications stuff so that all this money that's being raised and spent isn't all directed to television and radio commercials. Let's give free time, particularly on those airways that should belong to the public. And again, I don't want the next president, regardless of party, to have to spend time raising $1 billion or $2 billion. I want them to be president of the United States. So money is having this corrosive influence on our system, should be fully disclosed. And yeah, we ought to give average ordinary citizens the right to participate, but we ought not to overweight it and allow billionaires to dictate the direction.
So this is one Republican who says, hats off to Barack Obama. The kind of campaign he ran, the kind of engagement that he got, and the number of people that he got involved in politics wouldn't have been possible without the budget he had. I think everybody who seriously looks at that campaign realizes that. And I think that was a net good for democracy. And I just have to say to some of my Republican friends who fret over it, go out and do a better job yourself. And they're not going to be able to go out and do a better job themselves unless they can raise the resources to do that. I think it was a great thing. I think he did a great job, and I think we need more of that, not less of it, more freedom and not more restrictions.
A microphone over here, a hand, yes.
Hi, Geraldine Cave. I'm MPA 2011. One of the biggest criticisms of the current campaign finance system that we have is that it takes such a lot of money to run for office, and sometimes that can be a barrier for quality candidates, that those who run are those who can raise the most money and not necessarily those who are the most qualified. I wondered if the panel could comment on that criticism as to whether they thought the current system was narrowing the field or affecting the quality of people who run for public office.
One of the two of you want to take that?
I'll take a go at that. Money is actually the great equalizer. If you limit money, then people who are popular for other reasons are going to run. There's a big problem in the political system with what we'll call adverse selection. Okay, the kind of people who run for office, frankly, well, they're not like me, and they're not like most of you. They're different, and we just have to realize that and deal with it. And in fact, if someone has the ability to go to a few large donors and make the case that, hey, I can bring something different to the system, I think you add different kinds of candidates, or at least you open up different possibilities. It's not a cure-all, but I think on that particular criterion of does it open up to different type of candidates or close down, that the freer the money is, the more open you're going to be to more different types of candidates.
I want to respond to your question with two illustrations. The one is, go back and read the editorial on April the 1st, 2007. On April 1st, 2007, in the New York Times, they identified McCain, Clinton, and Obama as the front-running candidates for the presidency in '08 because they had raised the most money in the first cycle. I think there's a perception out there that the people who raise the most money are the ones that you ought to take seriously. In this last election, with all the money that you had in all of the different Republican primaries, there was a candidate, a guy by the name of Buddy Roemer. He was a Democrat when I served in Congress. He then became a Republican and became governor of Louisiana. And he said, I'd like to run for president as a Republican. My issue is the corrosive influence of money in politics. I'd like to be on the debates. The Republican Party froze him out because he wanted to talk about limiting money in politics and restricting money. So I think money does have an influence that is corrosive. It doesn't mean that the candidates with the most money always win. We saw in New Jersey where a candidate who had gazillions of dollars. But I can tell you, as a young preacher trying to run for Congress, I raised $3,000 for my first primary. My opponent raised $6,000. I raised $35,000 for my general election. My opponent spent $250,000. Money doesn't always win the election, but it sure gives you a head start to the kind of organizing that you talked about, that you want to see these candidates run. So money does have an impact.
Microphone, go ahead, sir.
Hi, Andrew Schwab, Policy Studies and History 03. Does money limit the scope of the issues that get talked about in the public square?
Are you directing that to one side or the other? Of the
Whoever
entire
wants to
panel?
take it.
Okay.
Boy, I say absolutely not, and here's why.
Sure you do.
Politicians want to talk about a certain range of issues. And so, for instance, abortion is hugely controversial, right? Because people feel very strongly about it one way or another. And I know lots of Republicans, for instance, who wish the Tea Party people would just shut up and go away. Vote for them, but pipe down. And so the effect of someone coming and spending money on politics is nearly always to take an issue that otherwise wouldn't be discussed and make it prominent in the discourse. So I think these people who come in, whether it's their personal hobby horse or a trade association that wants to push an issue like fracking, either way, the oil people or the environmental people, I think that's great. And a lot of times the candidates don't want to discuss that precisely because the issue is so hot. So I think the room for people to come in outside is a good thing for the political system.
I imagine you want to comment on that.
Yeah. Let me share just 3 quotes, and it happens to be from a famous person, but listen to these quotes. At bottom, the court's opinion on Citizens United is thus a rejection of the common sense of the American people. While American democracy is imperfect, few outside the majority of this court would have thought its flaws included the dearth of corporate money in politics. The influx of unlimited corporate money into the electoral realm also creates new opportunities for the mirror image of quid pro quo deals, threats both explicit and implicit. Starting today, corporations with large war chests to deploy on electioneering may find democratically elected bodies becoming much more attuned to their interest. But then this quote, it might also be added that corporations have no consciences, no beliefs, no feelings, no thoughts, no desires. Corporations help structure and facilitate the activities of human beings, to be sure, and their personhood often serves as a useful legal fiction, but they are not themselves members of we the people, by whom and for whom our Constitution was established. The quotes come from Justice Stevens in his dissent to Citizens United.
I have a microphone over here. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Quinn Warner. I'm an MPA from 2011. I guess my question is for the former FEC commissioner. In this debate, we're talking mainly about federal elections, and obviously they're the most public elections and the most visible, but we have, multitudes more of local elections throughout the country. In D.C., we have a mayor being investigated. We've had multiple people being arrested for shadow campaigns and illicit donations, things like that. A lot of the focus is obviously on Supreme Court laws at the higher level. Do you feel that the lower level, the smaller elections, the campaign finance structure in this country is suitable and not broken in those instances? Or do you think that the local jurisdictions, the states, the cities, things like that, have the capacity and the ability to monitor their own elections?
Well, America is sometimes referred to as the laboratory of democracy, and I think it's one of the great things about the country. And for those of us who work in the campaign finance field and look at the laws across the range of states, there's a marvelous experimental field out there because we have public financing systems that are you can't make them mandatory anymore, but they're very attractive to candidates. We have systems with lots of regulation. We have systems like Virginia's with almost no regulation at all. Anyone can give any amount of money they want to, anytime. Don't seem to have a lot of corruption there. And so I think there's actually a huge disconnect. I can't explain exactly, well, I can explain how this happens, right? In states like like frankly, New Jersey and Connecticut that have histories of corruption, there's a reaction of passing a regulatory statute to try to fix it. And maybe that helps some, maybe it doesn't. But it doesn't correlate very well to the overall level of corruption in the state, because you go to Virginia and Utah and they have very open campaign finance systems, no corruption. But I do want to make the point that I made before, which is that these campaign finance systems regulations aren't magic bullets to solving corruption problems. And in fact, when you have corrupt systems, the corrupt politicians simply look at the local campaign finance system as one more game they can play to get a kickback or facilitate a bribe or something like that. And so I'm not saying we shouldn't try to do something, but I'm simply saying that they're not going to fix things that, again, those systems aren't designed to fix.
So I'm going to take a shot at this. My complaint, and the reason why I think you ought to vote in our favor, is if you believe what you just heard, then the system's broken. It's just broken in that it's way too regulatory. It's unconstitutional, it's squashing people's rights, it's doing all kinds of bad things. It is as if in Virginia, to use your example, which those of you who don't know, Virginia allows unlimited contributions to candidates. Okay, so it's any kind of money can go to a candidate. It is as if we had over time a series of court decisions said, you can give unlimited money to all kinds of candidates except on Thursdays. And on Thursdays, only individuals can give, and on Tuesdays, partnerships can give, except only partnerships with certain letters in their name. The problem we have with the federal system is we didn't start with Virginia. Right? We didn't start, in 1974, his class didn't get together and say, let's have the following campaign finance system. We're going to create these organizations. We're going to call them independent expenditure only organizations. That'll colloquially be known as super PACs. And they'll report, and they'll have these rules. And then we'll go and we'll create in the tax code a series of nonprofit organizations, and they'll be able to interact this way. And if they're ideological groups of right-to-life organizations, then they'll have these rules. Instead, Congress actually put in place a very, very heavy hand, in your view, very, very comprehensive set of rules. Expenditure limits on candidates, expenditure limits on independent groups, contribution limits, bans on much greater restrictions on parties. And what has happened is over time, that has just gotten unwound. And my point is that when they passed McCain-Feingold, they tried to patch the tapestry, put patches on where the holes were. And whether it's right or wrong, right? You think it's right and you think it's wrong. My point as a practitioner is the Supreme Court and the lower courts have simply taken the patches off and made some other holes. So the system now is just broken. You know, it's not someone on the left, it's someone on the right. I noticed that both, I believe Justice Kennedy in the Citizens United opinion, and I believe Sarah Palin has commented several times, that words to the effect is you shouldn't need a phalanx of campaign finance lawyers to run for office. But yet they do, and they do because, not because the system is so complicated, because it was complicated in 1974, but because you actually can't if you read this book, it says stuff that isn't true, right? It says that corporations may not make expenditures, when in fact they can. So the problem is the system has become incredibly complicated, and you need to understand the history of the agency and what the courts have said in this jurisdiction or that jurisdiction, what provisions of the act have been ruled unconstitutional, which ones are in constitutional doubt but haven't been yet ruled unconstitutional. And it's just a broken system that needs to be, whether you go back to the public financing system. I think you almost said it, the public financing system is broken in your view. So I think that whether you think the solution is a more libertarian one or a more regulatory one, I think for purposes of today, since I am all about getting your votes, did I mention that? I offer you nothing but my persuasion, but I want your vote nevertheless. For purposes of tonight, I will say you should vote that the system is broken.
Do you want to make a quick response to that? And we'll go on to the next question after that. Go ahead. Do it.
So Mr. Elias' position is that out there must be some perfected system that regulates with perfect clarity, simplicity. It's not there, and that's not what we're voting about. What we started off with was a very complicated, very heavy-handed set of speech regulations that suppressed ordinary, average Americans from being able to engage in the political process. And what we've had, yes, it's patchwork, but those holes, the pages you ripped out, those are people speaking. Those are people exercising their rights to engage in the political process. And along the way, that gets better. That's what the Supreme Court calls breathing room. We're opening up space for people to get out in the process and to persuade their neighbors, to be able to talk about the issues they care about without having to check in with the government, without having to worry about criminal penalties applying to them simply for exercising First Amendment rights. That's where we're moving towards. And the fact that we're not completely there, that's an aside. We have moved in such positive direction in opening it up, and we continue to move in that way. It would only make sense to say that we are on the correct path and that the system does a fine job of balancing both the interests of campaign finance regulation with constitutional interests.
Sir, you've got a question.
My name is Paul Jossi, and I'm the first audience speaker who did not go to Syracuse. So I will try to. I hope my question isn't as excellent as the previous ones. Mr. Edgar was lamenting the fact that $6 billion was spent in the last general election. Now, this is an election that happens every 4 years, and it affects 300 million plus people. I'm just curious how that $6 billion compares to how much money the federal government spends every year, how many hours it takes the federal government to spend $6 billion, and how that $6 billion, if you divide it by the 300 million people, how much money that comes out to. Thank you.
Since you used my name, what school did you go to? I think it's a false comparison. I think particularly anyone who lived in Virginia or in Pennsylvania or Ohio or in the battleground states, you know that a ton of money was spent. And you know that a lot of that money came in through all kinds of variety of sources. And if you were interested in knowing who was buying their access, it was really hard to tell because, as was said, the system is broken. I got to say, yes, every 4 years we spend a ton of money. I also have to say, as a former House member, every House member raises between $1.2 and $1.4 million every 2 years to scare off their opponents. And the Democrats and Republicans tell their members, their freshman members, you ought to spend 20 hours a week raising money for your reelection. I want to see, this is a crazy idea, I think we ought to change the House term from 2 years to 4 and only have a third of the House up every 2 years. Why are we having 90% of the House members reelected automatically because they know how to raise money? Let's open it up. You want to open it up? Let's open it up. One person doesn't have to represent that particular district forever. But I want to make this point. In 1994, when our friend Newt Gingrich, who I knew in 1977, came to Washington with a contract on America, he instituted an interesting thing. He said, if you want to be chair of the Ways to Be Mean committee or any one of the major committees, you have to raise $500,000 for your party. And if you want to be a subcommittee chair, you have to raise $250,000. So here's a congressman in the House raising the $1.2 million for their reelection. If they want to be in leadership, having a leadership PAC, and if they want to make nice to their party, raising money for their party. So they're out there 20, 30 hours a week raising all of this money for elections and not legislating. We saw yesterday in the Senate the impact of money in politics. So the system is broken, crushed. It's in bad shape and needs to be repaired. And I want elected officials, once elected, to serve the public interest and not the special interest. Right. I want the lobbyists to be back in their home districts and states, not over here on K Street. And I want to have small contributions multiplied. We had a bill before the House and Senate. House bill was Fair Elections Now, where if you raised $100 in your district, it got matched by $400 of public funds. If you raised that in Hollywood or New York, you could keep your $100, but it wouldn't be matched, so that the focus would be back on the district or the state from which you come. We can do better, and we can get elected officials who actually do better.
So I want to just address that briefly because I take it the reference to yesterday was about gun control, and I just want to make the point that that didn't have anything to do with money. And the NRA has a PAC. That wasn't about that. That was about the fact that we have this big citizens group who lots of people fervently, they joined and they're excited about it and so on like that, and lots of people feel on the other side, and we had this huge tragedy in Connecticut, which I acknowledge. But people felt strongly about that issue, and it was because people will come out to vote on that issue, one way or the other, that senators decided they needed to or didn't need to vote this way. It wasn't about the money, it was about how citizens were organized, and whether I like or dislike that outcome, campaign finance isn't the way to solve that issue.
Microphone over here somewhere. Yeah. Go ahead, sir.
Hi. Charles Cutshall, bachelor's 07, MPA 2009. I'd like to echo the point that Mr. Edgar made, which is an echo of the dissent from Judge Stevens, which is that our government, the beautiful thing about our government, the ideal of our government is that it's a government for the people, by the people. And Mr. Mason, you made the point that the reason that the law was passed was to prevent corruption. And I would say that's right. And the reason that we want to prevent corruption is to ensure that the members who are elected to represent us represent our best interest, the best interest of the people. Mr. Barr, the point that you made, that money has allowed us to reach a greater audience, more time on the air, more debates, I would agree with that. But what I would add to that is that the money that is financing those debates and the money that is financing that increased airtime is money that's provided by the few. That you cannot get elected unless you have special interests, unless you go to those larger donors. And as that pool gets smaller, the best interests of the people are lost.
Response?
Amen.
We've got a microphone over here.
I think he wants.
Oh, you do? You did want to say? Oh, sorry, Ben. Go ahead.
Okay. So, Worldwide Wrestling didn't win their Senate seat. You know, Linda McMahon spent untold millions several times trying to secure the Senate, and we have a host of poor candidates, poorly performing candidates who are very wealthy who are unable to do this. The notion that we must somehow guard the people from these large amounts of money strikes me as inherently anti-democratic. It's fueling messages. Either we as a nation believe in the capacity of our individual citizens to be able to reason, to be able to evaluate arguments, whether they're funded by the Koch brothers or whether they're funded by a union or a small grassroots organization, or we give up on that premise. People have that ability to engage in self-governance. They have the ability to evaluate the relative merits of arguments. If you don't like anonymous speech, as Mr. Edgar doesn't, then you don't support that candidate and you don't lend your support for individuals who partake in that. We, the people, can change us. We, the people, can do this in a voluntary manner without running over constitutional liberties, without having to go in and report with the federal government because we want to go out and spend more than $2,000, as the federal law currently states, for criticizing candidates. We have moved in such a positive direction, moving the law to liberalize this and to increase, as I mentioned, the diversity of viewpoints, more arguments, more candidates. This is a good thing. That's why you should vote for the fact that today campaign finance reform is indeed not broken.
One last question from whoever has the microphone up here.
That would be me. Hi.
I see you. Thank
Okay.
you. Go ahead.
Janice Walt, Grenadier. I am shocked that you would say Virginia is a good example. Virginia is rated 47th and 49th in corruption. The tipping point is Moran's son, and we are only going to see more and more of that because we have the internet. And thanks to the internet, we have a gentleman who, Bill O'Keefe, who went out and has done several different movies that caught people at things, and he's been fined for doing that. We need to look at our press as having more freedom to come out and not be afraid of the consequences of letting the public know about the corruption. And so I'd like to hear from y'all how you don't know about that corruption, how you don't see it in Virginia, and that you can tout that as a direction to go in. There is no accountability in the state of Virginia.
Defense of Virginia?
Let me introduce Mr. O'Keefe's lawyer.
Full disclaimer, yes, I represent Project Veritas and James O'Keefe and investigative journalists. You know, let's frame this properly, okay? What James O'Keefe does that is excellent is he engages citizens nationwide to insist that government operate in a clean way, in a fair way, and that's accountable. And it's not done through a blue ribbon government commission. It's not done through governmental bureaucrats sitting on high. It's not done through forms and reporting. It's because citizens give a damn, and they're engaged in the electoral process. They're engaged in local government, and they're going to hold their elected officials accountable. And we do that by opening and allowing the exercise of liberty. We do not do it by increasing regulations. As to the particulars of Virginia, I think there are different metrics that can rate it, and I don't know that I'm particularly qualified to speak to its relative level of corruption or excellence in governance. But my point here in ending, I know that we're wrapping up, is to say, you know, if you believe in that fundamental notion that Americans have the ability to self-govern, and you support individuals like, whether they're on the left or whether they're on the right, the left goes into animal slaughterhouses and shows supposed atrocities that are going on there. Allowing this breathing space is vital. That is what we have secured through judicial review, slowly, painfully, citizen engagement in the process. That's why the system isn't broken today. It's to be rewarded.
Let me ask now the affirmative if they want to make a closing statement. 2 minutes for a closing statement.
I yield my 1 minute to my colleague who has 1 minute.
Fair enough.
You can tell he was in the House. I will be brief. I'll try to actually use less than the 2 minutes. I just want to make 2 points. First of all, well, 3 points. First of all, thank you all for coming. I appreciate you all undoubtedly have a number of things that you could otherwise be doing at 6 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. So I appreciate all of you coming and the attentiveness that you've shown. 2 other quick points. The first is we live in a democratic system, and we operate through that democratic system. And where Congress has chosen to regulate and set a system in place for campaign finance, I think we need to be careful in what the consequences of judicial decisions are. It doesn't mean that the courts don't get the final say over the constitutionality. But I think as we look at what is left after the courts have done their bidding, we need to go back and say, does what is left still meet the fundamental policy judgment that our elected officials made? If our elected officials made a policy judgment that we ought to have disclosure, then subject to court decisions, we ought to have disclosure. What's odd about the disclosure example is that 8 justices of the Supreme Court actually in Citizens United upheld disclosure. In fact, the conservative justices took some pains to take comfort in what they were doing in striking down the corporate ban because they believed there was complete disclosure. You have the minority leader, Senator McConnell, throughout a long period of time championing the need for more disclosure. Remember, the 527 disclosure bill was a bill championed not by the Democrats in Congress, though they voted for and supported it, but by Senator McConnell and the Republicans. So where you have policy judgments that have been made, like on issues like disclosure, I think we need to be very careful in saying, you know, the Constitution, 8 justices of the Supreme Court believe the Constitution provides for disclosure. Justice Scalia, in a subsequent disclosure case, talked about home of the brave in talking about the need for disclosure and the virtue, not in anonymous speech, but the virtue in standing up in the town square and saying what it is you believe in. So I think we need to, as we have these debates and consider whether or not the system is working as it is or not, we need to ask ourselves, When the legislative branch, when the people spoke through legislation in 1971 and 1974, and then in McCain-Feingold in 2002, and expressed their policy decisions, do we still have, after the Supreme Court and the courts have looked at the Constitution, do we still have something that meets up with those policy judgments? And I would say we don't. I would say that what we have now does not match up with the policy judgments of the elected officials, and therefore the system is broken.
Thank you. Negative has the last word, and you have 3 minutes for the last word.
I'll try not to take it. But
I wouldn't tell the truth when I said I'd go under.
Congressman Edgar had a couple of quotes, and I want to almost end with a quote. It's very easy to point to individual commissioners and say, they're being heavy-handed, or they're unwilling to enforce the law. I do think we need to acknowledge that there are some very, very difficult and thorny questions as to what pieces of the law are enforceable, or in what circumstances, after a series of court decisions that radically reordered and changed the campaign finance system. Marc, Elias. Now, Mr. Elias and I agree about a lot, and we agree about that, except what's the conclusion that we're to draw from that? And the case that Mr. Barr and I are making is this is the system. Congress doesn't have the final say. The courts have the say. And in fact, these are very difficult and thorny issues. And the fact that we've come to a set of mixed and incomplete decisions and still have work to do to calibrate the system to fit with the Constitution and our policy preferences doesn't mean it's broken. It means the system is working. Thank you.
Let me just say in closing, I want to thank the panelists again for a really, really, really great debate and for being mostly mindful of the time. And I want to thank all of you again for attending and contributing. I have one reminder that I want to give you, but first I think we should give the debaters and ourselves another round of applause. We do have some really good Campbell and Maxwell swag for the four of you outside.
Campbell's soup and Maxwell coffee?
That too. For your votes on tonight's debate, as you leave the auditorium, you will be given a ballot. It has the same question that you answered on your way in. So please check that off and return the ballot immediately, and then we'll announce the results during the reception. And that brings me to the reception. We've got some great food and drink outside. Please join us for that. We can continue this conversation, or we can find something else to argue over. So thank you very much.
Good to debate you guys.